Lady, we're going to move to straight to our next witness, which is Mr. Burnham.
I'll do the proper one.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. If you'd like to repeat after me, I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Sorry if we've kept you waiting, Mr. Burnham.
No problem.
Thank you. For the record, can you give us your full name, please?
Andrew Murray Burnham.
Well, Mr. Burnham, thank you very much for attending today. Thank you for assisting the inquiry by providing your statement, which we have seen and which is before us. And you've had the opportunity to read that statement today, haven't you?
I have.
And you can confirm that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief.
I can.
Thank you. I'm just going to briefly turn to your professional background, if I may. You have a long political career. You were a Member of Parliament for Lee for under 16 years between 2001 and 2017, is that correct?
It is.
And you held a number of ministerial roles in government during that period, including, but not limited to, you were a Minister of State for Health in 2006 to 2007. You were Chief Secretary to the Treasury from 2007 to 2008. And you held two cabinet roles between 2008 and 2010. First as Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and then perhaps more relevant for our purposes, you were Secretary of State for Health from the 5th of June 2009 to 11th of May 2010. We'll come back to it in due course, but it's relevant because during that time you were Secretary of State during the swine flu pandemic.
I walked into the Department of Health in early June 2009, and 3 days later, a global pandemic was declared. And I've always said to the former Secretary of State, Alan Johnson, who was walked out of the door in the other direction, that he was a master of political timing always, and I think that demonstrates it.
Well, let's see if we can master timings today in relation to your evidence. And we will touch upon, perhaps after lunch and adjournment, the position and your observations between the pandemic, swine flu, and more recently in relation to COVID pandemic. After you left government, because your party was out of government, you held a number of positions in opposition as a shadow Secretary of State in relation to education, health, and in fact, you're a shadow Home Secretary as well.
I was.
And it's, of course, a matter of public records. You were elected as Mayor of Greater Manchester in 2017.
Yes.
And you're currently in your second term of that
Yes.
position. I want to briefly just set out how the Mayor of Greater Manchester fits in terms of structure-wise, and perhaps try and do it simply if I can. Is this a fair summary? Is that there's the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, that's the upper tier of local government, where there's sitting above, but alongside, the 10 metropolitan borough councils within Greater Manchester.
Yes. The Greater Manchester Combined Authority, or the GMCA, is the 10 councils. Unlike the GLA, which is a separate body above local government,
yes.
The 10 councils come together to create the GMCA. So we very much sit alongside them. I'm one of 11, you could say, but maybe the captain of that 11.
And it covers a population of Greater Manchester, which is 2.8 million approximately.
Yes.
And as in you chair the GMC as you describe, and your role is to steer the work of the authority leading on issues such as the economy, transport in particular, and police and fire services.
Yeah, I am the Police and Crime Commissioner for Greater Manchester.
And you don't have, or the Mayor does not have, a public health function.
Not directly, no.
No.
Although we have a very extensive devolution agreement, and the things that I am responsible for, like housing and other things, do impact directly on health and public health.
Yes. When one compares your role as Mayor of Greater Manchester and the authority with the Mayor of London and the Greater London Authority, which we just heard about, there is a difference, isn't there?
There is.
A difference in, if perhaps just to assist you, a difference in relation to Civil Contingency Act.
Yes, the GLA and the Mayor, I understand, are designated as a Category 1 responder in the Civil Contingencies Act. That's not the case for the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, or indeed any of the other combined authorities across England.
And pausing there, a Category 1 responder is someone who has a duty under the Civil Contingency Act to plan, prepare, train and respond to an emergency.
Yes. We played that role in the COVID pandemic at a Greater Manchester level. So I convened a COVID emergency committee to sit above, if you like, the local resilience forum, so that we were working in a highly joined up way across the whole of our city region. But formally, we do not have that designation in the Civil Contingencies Act, and it would be helpful if we did.
And that's something which we will return to at the end in terms of the lessons learned or things to improve going forward. You touched upon the the local resilience forum or fora. That's a forum in a region or an area where a number of Category 1 responders come together to respond to emergency or plan for emergency.
Yes, and the Greater Manchester Resilience Forum played a huge role in steering us through our response to COVID.
Yes. Let's just move on to the next topic, which is the early days and awareness of COVID leading up to the first lockdown. And in relation to that, I can perhaps summarise your evidence, if I may, and you can tell me if I'm on the right or wrong track. You say in your statement that you first became aware of COVID through media reports, and your first real engagement was through the local Chinese community in Manchester. And there is a strong Chinese community in Manchester, is that correct?
That is correct. Manchester as a city had a long-standing twinning arrangement with Wuhan. So some of the familial connections that our Chinese community had were with that area. So I attended 2 community meetings in January, and I think one going into early February, when the community was in a very high state of alarm and was asking for my help to get PPE through Manchester airports, donations sent over. So I really became very aware of just how serious the situation was in China in that period of time.
Yes. And it was an outward-looking view, it was concern for those people in China through that Wuhan lens. You did mention in your statement, again summarising if I may, that there was a first roundtable meeting on the 18th of February regarding COVID in Manchester. But it really was only until the 1st of March that the Strategic Coordination Group, the SCG, we've heard about those already this morning, was set up by the Resilience Forum, the local Resilience Forum. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And that was in response to the first COVID case in Greater Manchester.
Yes.
And thereafter, you describe that it was really only around the 13th of March that your perception of the seriousness of the threat of COVID changed. Was that the position?
Well, it was changing all the way through that period. As I said earlier, as someone who had experienced a pandemic in 2009 as Secretary of State, I obviously had an understanding of how the situation might develop. So I was watching it carefully. I was following statements from the World Health Organization. So I could see the picture changing, and so our understanding was building. And Greater Manchester, in that period, was starting to develop the arrangements that we would need, or we felt we needed. The degree of coordination that we would need to pull together was building.
In relation to that, if I may, just to assist, is in sort of setting up those arrangements, you mentioned that it was around the 18th of March that you, together with the leader of the local councils, established the Greater Manchester COVID-19 Committee on the 18th. You mentioned that a few moments ago.
Yeah.
On the 20th of March, the SCG declared a major incident.
Yes.
The position really was that it was in March where Manchester started to really move into a response phase. Is that correct?
I think that would be fair. I mean, clearly we'd taken some steps in February to coordinate, and we were building our response. But you're right, the response phase began more formally in March. And obviously the establishment of a COVID emergency committee, which was myself, the 10 leaders, the 10 directors of public health, senior players in the Greater Manchester system, the chief constable, chief fire officer. You know, that wasn't something that we were required to do, but as a mature administration across the city region, it's something we decided to do ourselves to make sure we were as highly coordinated as we could be. So,
could I just ask a question in relation to that?
Yeah.
So we described how Manchester was responding and putting in those structures in March. Was that something which was brought about regionally, self-created, or was that something under direction from central government?
No, there are some things, obviously, that are required in statute, but the Greater Manchester COVID Emergency Committee was a voluntary initiative on our part to make sure, as I said, that the political leadership of the city region was very much knitted into the administrative leadership of the city region. And as I said, that we were as connected and as joined up as possible.
Looking back now, with the benefit of hindsight, do you think Manchester perhaps should have done more and done more earlier?
It's hard to say because we weren't getting any guidance from a national level. It wasn't been made clear to us, you know, what we should be doing. So we were, as I say, we were putting together the picture ourselves and beginning to develop the structures that we thought we were going to need to get us through what lay ahead. So it's always with hindsight, you would say, well, it would have been better had we done it earlier. But actually, we had started to pull together these collaborative arrangements in February. We had a meeting, for instance, with all of our big voluntary sector partners in that month as well. So, you know, always you might say, well, in an ideal world, it could have been sooner. But in the absence of very clear instructions from central government, I think, you know, we were quite unique actually in establishing our own full committee that, as I say, united political leadership with more administrative leadership in the city region.
And was the seriousness of the pandemic in late February and early March clear to you as the Mayor of Manchester, Greater Manchester?
It was clear, and in that period, as is referenced in my statement, I started to make more public comment on pandemic policy nationally. Having been Secretary of State in a global pandemic, I felt I had something to contribute that was meant to be helpful. I remember the day when I saw an article from a health minister appear behind a paywall. And I just thought to myself, this isn't right. We're not getting this right. You know, people need information at this moment in time. You can't have articles behind paywalls. And I kind of went public that day with a long thread of tweets, kind of being honest about my experience as Secretary of State in the swine flu pandemic. And we made many mistakes on communications. It's hard communicating in a pandemic. And I tried to share that honestly and openly. And I called actually for a daily briefing. I said that there should be, and I said there should be a briefing that's not led by politicians, because a mistake I had made in swine flu was giving out information which always then was seen politically, and then it goes into the fray and all the rest of it. At that time, we agreed that the Chief Medical Officer of the time, Professor Sir Liam Donaldson, would lead our briefings without politicians present, and I advocated that would have been a better better approach.
So your view would be a scientist alone giving a scientific briefing and politicians giving a briefing separately?
I think so, and I think some of what's come out through this inquiry is how sometimes those different views were there and they weren't clear to the public because people wouldn't be invited to the press briefing at number 10. I mean, it needs to be better than that. If there's a disagreement between the scientists and the experts and the ministers, I think people need to know that, and therefore that separation is helpful. I'm not saying that every briefing should be done in that way, and it would be appropriate for the Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet to stand with experts from time to time, but every day, the problem with that is it just makes communications too political.
Thank you. And that's your reflection from your time as Secretary of State?
Yes, it is.
I've got two questions on that, Mr Burnham. Firstly, don't you then have a problem potentially of inconsistent messaging?
Well, hopefully not, Chair. So you would try, as a government, not to allow that. You would hope, would you not, that ministers would be following the advice. I think the experts' briefings should relate more to the epidemiological information, the profile of the virus, the advice to the public. I always felt uncomfortable saying, oh, you know, wash your hands, sneeze, and this, don't do this, do that. That's not really for politicians to do. That is for, I would say, for experts to do. I think the public receive it differently from an expert than they do from a politician. And I think there is a role for people standing together, as I said, but at the same time, just giving more factual information to the public, in my view, is better done without politicians in the room.
But then you have the second risk I'm going to put to you, which is that some members of the public associate the expert with the decision-making. In other words, they attribute responsibility for the decision-making to the expert if you put them up front.
I think what I would say, Chair, is better separate the roles of different people so that the public can see those different roles. That was all merged together, I would say, in the communications through the COVID pandemic, particularly in 2020. I think if the expert said, this is our view and this is what we see in the evidence and these are the options for ministers, and then the next day the minister said, well, and now we're doing that. I think that I'm not going to sort of put a huge emphasis on this because it's hard to communicate in a pandemic, as I said, and I made mistakes as Secretary of State in that area, which I tried to share in the spirit of getting it right. But I think mistakes were also made in the COVID pandemic. There should have been the drumbeat of briefings should have been more officials and experts. But occasionally then ministers would come in together where we're now taking a decision based on the evidence you've been hearing for the last few days and our decision is this. I just think that would have helped everybody. Certainly, as we will come to, I'm sure, over Tier 3. I don't think it was understood at the time that SAGE had given very different advice to ministers. It looked like everyone was joined up.
Mr. Burnham, I think we're going to come back to that. I don't want to get too much out of order. My lady, there's one small topic which is linked to this. Perhaps I could deal with that, which is linked to communication. So, Mr. Burnham, I want to stick with communication.
Yep.
And how difficult it is. But also, in terms of chronology, we are around just before the first lockdown. And the announcement around that time from Mr. Jenrick in around the 22nd of March, or a little bit earlier, about the need for shielding and shielding those people. And in particular, I've been asked to explore with you in relation to domestic abuse, those who are at risk of domestic abuse, your concerns at that time in relation to those announcements and the impact for those who were at risk of domestic abuse.
Well, we were immediately on that issue, principally because the Right Honourable Beverly Hughes, who was my Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime at the time, was very concerned about those issues. And I think this is where you have politicians in the room with officers. Those issues perhaps get brought out more quickly. We were always conscious of the social impact of lockdowns. What would be the effect of shielding of lockdowns of different forms? And we were concerned, given, sadly, the high rate of domestic abuse in parts of Greater Manchester, that could exacerbate those concerns, and who would be there to help people in situations when they were trapped in a very abusive situation.
And did you raise those concerns with central government?
We did. We discussed this issue a number of times. As I said, we always had the Chief Constable or his deputy at our COVID emergency committee, and they took very seriously what we were saying, and we did relay those concerns to central government.
Thank you. Lily, is that a convenient time?
Certainly. We will complete your evidence this afternoon, Mr. Burnham. 2:05, please.
All rise.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Burnham, welcome back. Before we continue evidence, can I invite you just to slow down a little bit, because there's a record being kept of what you're saying, and also answers. If we could try and make them a little bit shorter, I think paradoxically we will cover more, if that's all right. Let's see how we get on. In terms of the timeline, we were just coming up to the first lockdown in March 2020. And I just wanted to deal with the initial contact with central government in the lead up to the first lockdown. And you touch upon this in your evidence. There was 3 meetings. The first on the 11th of March, which I'll summarise. You met Baroness Veer, who was a junior minister in the Department of Transport at that time, and that was in relation to funding as the public transport. The second meeting was on the 12th of March, and this is one of more relevance, perhaps, was meeting with Robert Jenrick, who was the then Secretary of State for the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, MHCLG, as it was then known as, now the Department of Levelling Up. And in relation to that meeting on the 12th of March, can you assist us? What did that relate to?
That meeting was to inform us about the commencement of the delay phase. And in effect, I think it was the introduction of the shielding arrangements. But there were also some strange announcements about people not taking cruises or school holidays not happening. It was not an announcement that was in the sort of, getting close to the heart, the enormity of what lay ahead a few days later. I think we talked about PPE, how were we getting on with local arrangements. It was quite a relaxed meeting, if I remember rightly.
But an opportunity for you to speak with the Secretary of State for MHCLG, which was the liaison department between central government and local government.
Yes, and if I remember, I think we were beginning to say to him, we're becoming more worried, it feels like it's changing, and it was a good opportunity. And although relations would get more difficult later in the year, at that point, the fact that he was convening the mayors to have that type of discussion was a good thing.
The last meeting before lockdown, in fact, was on the 23rd of March, which was the day lockdown was formally announced by the then Prime Minister. And you had a meeting that evening at 6:30 with the Secretary of State for Transport, who was Grant Shapps at that time. And that was with other Metro mayors, and that was in relation to transport as well. Was there any indication at that stage that lockdown was about to be announced?
I see, from my memory of that period, it wasn't so much what was happening in those meetings, it was what was happening outside of them. From the meeting with Robert Jenrick up until the 23rd of March, I can remember things becoming increasingly fraught, to the point where on the Monday of the 23rd of March, I think I appeared on Good Morning Britain and called for lockdown, a national lockdown. And I remember debating with my team, it felt strange to say it when the government weren't saying it at that time. And we decided it was right to say it because of what was coming through our directors of public health. So it felt like the whole world was kind of saying, this, we can't carry on like this. And yet, from memory, I think Grant Shapps possibly alluded to there might be an announcement coming later. You can probably guess what it is type approach in that meeting. But no, we were not sat down and briefed on the implications of national lockdown. And
it's a matter of a record. 2 hours later, the Prime Minister made the national announcement on national television. Another feature in terms of communication and coordination, which is the focus of these questions, relates to COBRA and whether you were invited to attend any COBRA meetings. You've heard questions being asked of Mr. Khan in relation to that. So in the lead up to lockdown number 1, were you invited to any COBRA meetings?
No,
Did you ask to attend any COBRA meetings?
repeatedly.
In what way? Was this via officials, back channels, requests with Secretary of States?
I referred to a thread that I put out on Twitter in the session before lunch. Pretty sure that I said there that the mayors should be invited to, if not all, but certainly some COBRA meetings. And the reason I said that was because I chaired it during swine flu. And it was a very open environment. It wasn't a small number of people just meeting in total secrecy and, keeping it all to themselves. Using the facilities of the Cabinet Office, we would often have a meeting with ministers in the room, but then people able to dial in from around the country.
So in your view, there was a way in which Metro mayors could have been participants in COBRA, which was practical?
Certainly. I mean, it should have happened. I have a memory of chairing a weekly meeting during swine flu where in the Cabinet Office, with all of the technology, you could bring in voices from around the country. And I remember a council leader here or a official in the Welsh or the Scottish government would intervene in those meetings. It was, I would say, the way it should have been done.
Just in relation to that, we've heard other evidence regarding the actual utility of the COBRA meetings, whether there were much benefit to them. But at that time, from your perspective, what benefit did you think it would have been as an attendee at a COBRA meeting?
A structured environment where serious issues could have been properly raised. For instance, one that myself and the Mayor of the Liverpool City region raised right through the whole thing and never got a response, which was financial support for people on the lowest incomes, insecure work, to self-isolate if asked to do so, so people who had no access to sick pay. We repeatedly raised that issue.
We'll come back to that as a topic,
sure,
if I
may. But also people excluded from public support, the self-employed, freelancers. We were raising these issues, but in some ways they had nowhere to go. We raised them in the media because we had no alternative. If COBRA had been properly structured, we would have been able to put these issues on the agenda, have proper response to them, but we were never afforded that opportunity.
And in relation to that, you touched upon your colleague, fellow mayor, Metro Mayor, the Mayor of Liverpool, and both of you in May and June 2020 made a number of public announcements seeking that you would have the opportunity to attend COBRA. And in essence, is this a fair summary that you wish to have the voice of the English regions represented?
100%. Our worry was that there was a London centricity in decision making. And we probably wanted to create the balance in people's thinking by saying, look, this is how it seems from here. And genuinely, it was in the spirit of national emergency. We weren't there to use it as a platform for politics or anything like that. It was simply to say, we are worried. This is a challenging situation. We want to be heard and just, taken as seriously as anywhere else. I mean, a classic example would be the lifting of the first national lockdown.
So before we get to that, Mr. Burnham, if you just forgive me for interrupting, rewinding a couple of stages. You said that you had asked to attend, and then you mentioned a Twitter feed. Did you contact number 10 and ask to attend COBRA?
Yes. In many ways, Chair, the request was made. Did I write formally? I would have to check. I don't recall ever saying, please invite me to COBRA, but the point was made to ministers in conversations in some of the meetings that have been described. We would often make this point that it would be better if we were invited so we could discuss these things in a structured environment rather than in ad hoc meetings with ministers. Second question.
I have heard from others that COBRA is effective for a shorter-term emergency, but not for the longer-term emergency. What do you say to that?
Well, there needs to be a central coordinating body that brings together political decision makers in any emergency, whether it's short or long, I would say to that. be it COBRA or a cabinet committee. I did not attend one meeting of COBRA right through the pandemic, and people need to ask whether a city region with 2.8 million people in it should never have the opportunity to say, well, this is how it looks from here. The only UK government body that I attended was the one of the nations, chaired by Michael Gove, when we had an issue with Scotland and a travel ban. That was the only formal central government committee that I was asked to attend.
Which we'll come back to. We're going to stick to a structured approach, following on from your desire to have a structured approach.
Can I come back to national lockdown?
Yes, please. You want to go back to national lockdown? Yes. We're going back to March 2020.
I mean, it's just this is the critical thing. Well, this was May 2020, of course, by that...
This is coming... I am going to move on to that. You're now talking about leaving national lockdown, which I'm going to move on to in a moment. Let's stick to communication, and then we'll move to the next parts in the chronology. You used the words ad hoc in your statement, and indeed a few moments ago, your communications with central government. You also mentioned that there was reasonable official level communications between officials, civil servants.
Yes.
So there was that reasonable communication. There was political communication. We've touched upon some of it, but that was sporadic. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you mentioned this, we don't need to turn to it, paragraph 76, is that in your experience, ministers actively encouraged informal and private communications about significant decisions and often initiate them. And you use an example, several ministers, including the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. Was this a productive line of communication, WhatsApps, texts with ministers of state and secretaries of state?
It could be, and I often found it helpful that they would reach out in that way, but it wasn't adequate, because actually there needed to be a place where a mayor might raise something and everybody in the system heard it, and there wasn't such a facility. So it was better than nothing, but it wasn't sufficient.
In terms of the impact regarding, we've been talking about communication and coordination between local and central government from your perspective. And you touch upon this in your statement at paragraph 23. And you described the approach to the pandemic as overly top-down and overly centralised. There was a lack of adequate consultation and poor communications. It frequently felt chaotic. Is that the view you formed?
Very much so. It was massively centralised. You had a mature system like Greater Manchester that was simply bypassed. And the kind of thing that sticks in my mind from the period we're talking about is genuine astonishment when word came through from officials who were in good contact with civil servants in the departments saying that local testing would be stood down. To me, that was like, I could not even begin to get my head around why local testing teams in our, what were CCGs at the time, would be stood down.
So in relation to that, CCGs, to help everybody else,
Clinical Commissioning Group.
Yes. And this was on the 18th of March 2020, is when you've described as a significant key moment that you were informed that the local testing was stood down without consultation. Mm-hmm. And then you expressed a concern that the new location for testing from a central perspective was going to be at Manchester Airport. And that was
so that location was chosen without any consultation with us. So the airport might make sense if you're sitting in an office in Downing Street or in the Cabinet Office, or the airport, well, everyone can get... Well, no, they can't, actually. But there was a huge testing facility that opened that, in the end, people just couldn't get to. If you live in Oldham or Rochdale, you can't easily get to Manchester Airport, but that was not understood, it would seem. But they didn't ask us. No. I mean, fancy opening a testing station in Greater Manchester without consulting us on the location.
Oldham, Bolton, north of the city, airport, south of the city. Mm-hmm. And of course, if one has to travel, costs involved.
Yes.
I want to move on to the Metro Mayors Group and a meeting on the 1st of May 2020, which you and your fellow members of that group had with the Prime Minister. And there's a document which is at INQ 000202, which we have right in front of us. Thank you so much. And we see at paragraph 2 just what the metro mayors are. It covers a number of different regional areas, represents over 40% of the population of England, and it's a combined GVA. This is where you're going to be tested as a former Chief Secretary to Treasury. GVA stands for?
Gross value added.
We probably don't need to go into economics too much, but it really just shows that there is significant economic output from those areas.
Yes.
45% of the overall England GVA, 750 billion. And there's a request there empowering mayors to lead recovery planning for the regions would help put robust plans in place. So this is where we're still in that restrictions. We're looking forward to a period where restrictions may be eased. I want to move on, please, to paragraph 5, if I may. And this document, which was prepared by the Metro mayors and provided to the Prime Minister, is that correct?
Yes.
And in relation to that, it says recovery will be a national effort. We must work together to ensure alignment in planning and to give confidence to the country and our regions. To coordinate our efforts, we would welcome regular discussions with government. A monthly call between mayors, Prime Minister and Chancellor will help align our efforts. And what was the response at that meeting or thereafter in relation to this request for more regular communication?
Well, it didn't happen. I think we had one meeting with the then Chancellor, now Prime Minister, during the pandemic. One meeting, I think, possibly two with the Prime Minister. But this call did not meet with approval. And the thing I would just say, the M9, for people who don't know, this is a cross-party group of mayors.
We've heard this morning that there was at that time 2 Conservative mayors.
Yes.
And the bulk were Labour elected mayors.
In fact, more. There was a Conservative mayor in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, in the west of England, Tees Valley, and in West Midlands, Andy Street. The thing is, we take seriously our responsibility as mayors to work on a place first rather than a party first basis. And that's the strength that we can bring to UK governance, that we can, and we do, and we were prepared. You could see this in what we were saying to the government.
Well, a joint document from mayors from different political fields.
Yes. And in this moment in time, there was still very much a spirit of, we're all here to help. What can we do? Work with us. Yes. But then that changed through the year as we just weren't listened to, and that's how 2020 proceeded. The goodwill, the offers, we're here. How can we help? Work with us, use us.
Just pause there, because we're going to just one more part of this document, and then we'll move on to the deterioration. So paragraph 9, please, which is on page 2, the bottom of page 2. Thank you. So, summary, next steps. We would welcome a statement from government empowering mayors to lead regional recovery plans. And overleaf, please. Discussion with Chancellor on flexibilities and resources, reference to financial fundings, and regular meetings to align planning and agree action. So that was the position on the 1st of May. And then on the 10th of May, there was an announcement regarding the easing of lockdowns. The easing of lockdown, forgive me, as the path moving out of restrictions. And you described that as a really significant occasion in your experience from the perspective of Mayor of Greater Manchester. Why was that?
Similar to the standing down of local testing, I was astonished when word filtered through. It was a Wednesday morning, I think, to our COVID emergency committee that there may be an announcement coming. Someone said at our meeting about stay at home is ending tonight or tomorrow, and it's going to become stay alert. And I was, what? How? Here we had such a high case rate, or here I should say, Greater Manchester, we had a high case rate. And bear in mind that COVID had spread from south to north. It had moved up through the country, through the Midlands.
So there's a lag between London's progress. In other words, Manchester was further behind in the recovery than London.
I think experts would say a 2 to 3 week lag in terms of the way the peaks were experienced. but we were still very much closer to our peak than let's say, the southern half of the country.
So you had that surprise shock as to the announcement. Does it follow that there wasn't any consultation prior?
There was zero consultation, and this is the point about COBRA involving. This is a new infrastructure that we've built in this country of combined authorities and mayors. And in a situation like this, it can add huge value to the national response to a pandemic. It was largely bypassed.
And if you were consulted, what would you have said?
Don't lift it.
Because?
It's too early for Greater Manchester, because we had a higher case rate than other parts of the country. And it's why I say in my evidence statement that there was a London centricity in decision making. I think they were looking more at the picture in London, and they were more concerned with that than they were with the picture where we were. There was pressure to lift it from kind of voices here, and I think the decision was more influenced by that than what we were saying. We didn't, if we'd have been asked, we'd have told them that they shouldn't do it. And I think because of that, Greater Manchester was left stuck with a high case rate throughout the rest of 2020.
Which we're going to touch upon in a moment, and how that caused real difficulties. Last point regarding the message in May about easing of lockdowns and return to work, which was one aspect as well, which emerged. How was the return to work message received by you and your fellow Metro Mayors group members?
I mean, of course, everybody wanted to support the economy, but it was just more difficult for us. And I recall something from this period that needs to be remembered, which was a lot of people never left work. And in the less well-off parts of the country, people weren't, by and large, sitting in their gardens doing whatever on Zoom. They were in work. And in boroughs in Greater Manchester, a high percentage of people were working in warehousing or in manufacturing or in other things. The worry we had, and again it was one that I shared with the Mayor of the Liverpool City region, was the workplace guidance wasn't strong enough. The regulation said people should keep a 2-metre distance where possible. And we were inundated, actually, with complaints from distribution centres, warehouses across the northwest, both of us, people saying that their workplace wasn't safe.
If you had more notice, or any notice, would that have helped being able to respond to these queries on a local level?
Always the case.
Yes.
If we had been involved earlier in the discussion and we could see how the thinking was building towards regulations or new messages to the public, we would have been at least ready for those messages, and we'd been able to tell our own system how to get ready to implement it. It came mostly to a head for us in July, which we may want to get onto.
We will in a moment, but I want to deal with data, if I can,
Yes.
very briefly. I know it's not the most exciting subjects, but
Well, it was a big one for us in this period.
And an important subject as well. We're going to deal with data, and one of the issues you mentioned in June 2020 was you were struggling to manage the stubbornly high case rate in Manchester. That's what you say in your statement in paragraph 19. And your lead director of public health was having difficulties in accessing data regarding those who had tested positive. And this was something which was causing real difficulties. In terms of test and trace, that's something which is going to be considered by the inquiry at a later stage. So I want to deal with this quite shortly. But what was the issue in relation to getting data in June 2020 for you?
Well, we couldn't.
Yes.
We asked for patient identifiable data.
And that was refused. Is that the position?
It was refused.
And
it was refused for weeks and weeks and weeks. And I had to enter another media battle to try and get hold of that data. This was data that they really had no argument with us. In the law that they passed in early March, the COVID emergency legislation, COVID-19 was added to the list of notifiable diseases.
So a local authority was under a duty, a local public health authority was under a duty to report COVID-19.
It had to be reported.
Yes.
And yet this new test and trace system that they had outsourced said it didn't have to give us this data, and ministers said they didn't either, and we had to show them the law that they had passed, and this was important to us.
And why was it important in terms of getting that data?
Because lockdown had been lifted too early. We had a high case rate. Many of our residents were in jobs where they didn't get sick pay. They couldn't go home if they were ill because their employment wouldn't support them being paid if they were off ill. So we had fundamentals that were hard to deal with. We wanted the difference between the test and trace system and what we wanted to do for our proposals for more locally run tracing, contact tracing, was the national outsource system was making calls from call centres that nobody was answering. We wanted the data so we could knock on doors. And we said to the government right the way through this period, local contact tracing will be much more effective than the call centre approach. And in the end, I had to get Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service to kind of put a team together so we could say to the government, please just give us this data, let us do local contact tracing.
You got the data in due course
after a battle.
Yes, and was that applied? Did you apply that on a local level after obtaining the data? Did you do anything?
Yes, of course.
Yes. Okay. I'm going to move on to a different topic. Test and trace is one which we'll return back to. I want to deal with a topic which perhaps you never thought you were going to deal with when you were elected in 2017, is when you found yourself in a dispute with the First Minister from Scotland. I've been invited to address that with you. Is it
It was 2021, just because we're not just in 2020 now.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Thank you. In 2021, there was it a case? Is it 2021 or was it 2020 when there was an issue between you and the First Minister regarding a ban on the people of Manchester travelling to Scotland or people from Scotland travelling down to
2021.
21. Thank
Yeah.
you. So that's where we are in a time period. And is this a fair summary that there was an announcement by the First Minister that those people from Scottish people weren't allowed to travel to Manchester and people from Manchester weren't allowed to travel to Scotland?
Well, the first I knew about it was I was on my weekly phone-in on BBC Manchester, and a lady rang in from Bolton, and she said, our walking holiday's been cancelled in the Cairngorms because the guest house says they can't take somebody from a Bolton postcode. So I went back to the office and asked the office to check, and sure enough, we discovered that the Scottish Government had put a ban on Bolton people travelling to Scotland without any notification or information about that. And that was the first I became aware of the issue. Then, if you go forward a few days later, I was actually sitting in my garden the night after England had played Scotland at Wembley in the delayed European Football Championships. And there was a picture of lots of people in the fountain in Trafalgar Square. But underneath that photo was a headline that said, Scottish Government puts travel ban on Salford and Manchester. That's quite a big deal when you're putting a travel ban on. That was the first I'd heard of it, when they actually banned people from Manchester and Salford travelling to Scotland. No notification, no consultation, exactly what the Scottish National Party would always have accused Westminster of doing to Scotland. Well, they had done exactly the same to us.
So pausing there, no consultation in the way you've expressed. Was there any subsequent discussion about how this was going to be enforced? Was there police officers lining the platforms at Manchester Piccadilly?
Well, no, no, there weren't, and it wasn't our policy. We had no understanding of what they were trying to do, and as I understood it, the Scottish Government wasn't enforcing it because people from Scotland were coming down and getting off the train at Manchester Piccadilly. It was bizarre, if I'm honest. And as I say, Michael Gove invited me to the Committee of the Nations, and I had an exchange with the former First Minister at that meeting. In the days that followed, we pointed out that the case rate in Scotland had gone higher than in Manchester, Salford and Bolton, and it wasn't long before the travel ban was removed. No. But it was another example of how the lack of UK coordination.
A bizarre footnote to the pandemic, perhaps, and at that meeting with Mr Gove, I think there was an agreement between you and the First Ministers, a joint ambition towards a more unified approach as far as possible.
Yes.
And let's move on then, if we may. We're going to move well into summer 2020, so we're now going back a year, but in that summer 2020. And the 30th of July is the next significant date in 2020. That's when the UK government announced local restrictions on household mixing in Greater Manchester from midnight.
Yep.
How much notice and detail did you receive in advance of that announcement?
Minimal. I had a call around about 4 o'clock from the Health Secretary, and he said that we needed to do something because the case rate in Greater Manchester got too high. I said, yes, I can see that it is too high. We are not against doing something, but I can't just announce with you that I got to go through the local council leaders. He asked me if I would do that. This, in effect, would become what's known as Tier 2. So
it wasn't Tier 2 then, but
no,
as you say,
it wasn't
in effect,
called that.
Yes.
It was the first restrictions on household mixing.
Yes.
It was to be ourselves, parts of Lancashire and parts of West Yorkshire,
yes, that
would go under these restrictions in late July. But it was chaotic. You asked me before when you quoted me saying it felt chaotic. This was as chaotic as it gets because they were putting these restrictions on us. He gave me an hour to talk to our local leaders, and to those who claim that we were being obstructive, or we said we were ready to do. We can see the issue. We're ready to work with you. But we did immediately start to make the point that this is going to have an impact on people. It's going to have an impact on people's businesses. What I remember is that about 8 o'clock that night, the Health Secretary made a very cursory announcement to a TV camera in 4 Millbank that we would be going under these restrictions, and then all hell broke loose. My Twitter feed, which is, I was using it a lot at that time to have direct communication with people in Greater Manchester. It was just absolutely inundated with people saying, I'm a painter and decorator. I work in people's homes. Can I go to work tomorrow? I'm a childminder. Can I go to work tomorrow? I'm a domiciliary care worker. Can I go to work tomorrow?
So the lack of notice.
There wasn't a Q&A.
Yes.
There was not a UK government frequently asked questions that we could point people to. There was nothing. There was nothing put up on the website. If something went up, I think it was gone 11 o'clock that night, probably even later.
Did this also align with the time of Eid? That Eid was, the celebration of Eid was around that time. It did. And
I think there was a concern that there would be, large-scale household mixing, as we saw similarly played out at Christmas.
Yes.
It was the same thing got played out, didn't it?
But in terms of managing a message, doing it at such short notice for such a significant religious festival.
It was as if they hadn't realised it late, and and hence the situation we found ourselves in.
Going to move on slightly to this period of local restrictions, inverted commas, Tier 2 light, perhaps. You've got 12 areas within Greater Manchester.
10.
10, forgive me. Of those 10 areas, was the restrictions uniform to the 10 areas?
Initially, but you can imagine that there was lots of people were suffering under these restrictions. They weren't light. If you can't mix at home,
yes,
it has a real impact on people.
But there's a variation in Greater Manchester between cases. Some were higher in certain areas, some were lower in certain cases.
That's right. So at the time those restrictions went in, Wigan Borough, where I live, was quite low. And I would be out walking the dog and people say, why on earth are we in these restrictions? But then Wigan's case rate changed while we were in and went higher, and then the places that had higher had gone a bit lower, and then they were complaining. In the end, we used to have this weekly process with the government. It was at their Gold Committee. They would work through this whole process every week, reviewing restrictions. And our 10 boroughs would lobby at the GM COVID emergency committee saying, put the case forward for us to be taken out. You know, we want to be... We tried to stick with a greater management approach for a long time, but in the end it got hard to manage some of the differences, and I think Stockport were taken out at one point and Trafford possibly were taken out at one point.
Going forward, 10 individual areas, boroughs, is it practical having restrictions in Stockport and no restrictions in Bolton or vice versa?
No, it's not.
And why is that? What's the difficulty?
Well, it gets you to whether the tier system works. People are going to travel. Life does not end at a local government administrative boundary. People are going over that boundary every day. People don't live their life within the boundaries of those boroughs. You know, Greater Manchester, it's a system where everyone's crossing those boundaries every day, going around their work. As I say, it's something that might make sense in an office somewhere, but it didn't make sense. The reality of it didn't make sense.
So
for us.
on the ground, with a desire to make things work in the public interest, we moved through summer 2020 and we're into August, autumn 2020. And on the 8th of September, further restrictions were imposed by the UK government on Bolton. And that was without consultation, and you described that as another key moment. And why was that?
Because, again, from nowhere, all hospitality was closed in the borough of Bolton with no package of support for the businesses affected.
So pausing there, and not wishing to be London-centric, Bury has got a proud history. Would it be described as an area which is economically deprived, or parts of it have got economic deprivation?
Bolton?
Yes.
Yes, you would say it's quite mixed, but there are parts of Bolton that have significant deprivation.
So in relation to the need for financial support, was there any financial support offered when this was announced?
None.
And did you ask
And the
for
former Conservative leader of Bolton, who we worked with really closely during the pandemic, who sadly passed away the following year, he was saying to me, whatever you can do, Andy, I'll work with you. The government should not treat a place like Bolton like this. And the frustration we all felt was, because they'd just done it to Bolton, it was like no one else could see it, no one else in the country was bothered. But the impact there was really huge. And I do, just by an aside, just need to say, there was a strong feeling that Eat Out to Help Out had caused some of the problems that Bolton were experiencing.
Well, let's focusing on Bolton, not Bury, Bolton for a moment. So you had this background where there was restrictions which had now been imposed in Manchester since May.
Yep.
A lack of financial support.
Yes.
No financial support for the people of the businesses of Bolton.
True.
And was this something that you raised at any stage with Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Health?
Frequently.
And the response?
To be fair, he was more sympathetic, actually, than some of the other ministers that I spoke to about this matter. We were coming through the summer into the early autumn feeling increasingly frustrated. We'd spent pretty much the best part of a year by now saying, look, what's happening here? Help us. You know, help us with the contact tracing. Give us that data. Help us, support you to put in place measures rather than this chaotic way. And particularly help our people and our businesses if you're going to ask us to close them. And it felt like we were just shouting into the abyss in this period.
Let's move on to the 5th of October, which is a meeting between the Metro mayors and Mr. Hancock. This is something you touch upon in your statement, and perhaps we could bring that up at paragraph 70 of your statement. You describe how you had that meeting. Cases had risen across the country in September. We're into October, and that's the context. And at paragraph 70A, we wanted to see a clear role for mayors in informing decision-making, communication and engagement. And this since March had been limited. Again, this request for a regular meeting. Response from Matt Hancock in relation to this request for more regularity in contact between the Metro mayors and central government? Can you recall?
I think there was like a broad, oh yes, we must, and it needs to get better. But I'm just looking at the date on this note, 5th of October. It sticks in my mind because 2 days later was my 20th wedding anniversary. And I'd been out in Manchester with my wife, and we were getting a train home. And on the train, I remember we were looking at our phones, tomorrow's front pages, and one of them was pubs to close across northern England. So this was the first of the tier 3 issues coming. And that had not been mentioned to us in this meeting just a couple of days before.
Okay, so in terms of the timeline, your wedding anniversary 2 days after that, and you're going to refer to something which wasn't mentioned at this meeting. Let's turn to 70 paragraph B, please. Thank you, overleaf. And we'll see what else was mentioned at the meeting so everyone can put into context. You talk about the local restrictions, lockdown measures. I say you refer to in your statement. The tier approach being developed was helpful. This is the prospective tier approach. The current position at that time was too complex, and we must take steps to support people to comply. A crucial element of these plans must be to clarify on how and when places move back out of these measures, i.e. between the tiers. So the view at that stage, this is before you've experienced tiers, 1, 2 and 3, the view expressed was that the tier approach would be helpful. Why did you hold that view at that time?
This was an M9 document, if I remember, not a Greater Manchester document.
It's quoted in your. I think you refer to your statement.
Yeah.
And I dissenting voice from you in that.
So, because I was in a different. You've always got to remember, I was in a different position to the other 8 mayors, in that we'd been under restrictions and others hadn't, and I'd grown frustrated about the approach, particularly the lack of support. I think this was trying to articulate the view of everybody, and it did touch then on some of the frustrations everybody had, i.e. there was a feeling that if you go into these measures, you don't come back out again. They stay there, and everyone wanted a de-escalation sort of regime. When do you come out if you've gone in?
So if you pull out of the document again, so a consensus approach, if this is you producing what was presented as a Metro document, but you had your concerns. And we move on to financial support as well, the real need for financial support at paragraph C. That the impact of COVID was obviously not only on health. Lockdown could only work if financial support was in place for those we were asking to close businesses or limit activity.
Well, this was very much informed by the Bolton experience. And I was pleased that Andy Street supported it, as you can see.
Yes, he's a mayor based down in
the West Midlands. Yes. And he and I and the other mayors have always worked together in a very practical way, and we did in that period of time.
And a Conservative mayor.
Conservative mayor.
And we go up to paragraph 71, please, on the last point in relation to this. We advised that there was concerns about the proposed tier system, to put in context, with restrictions and no identifiable support. Support was most likely to be available from a national circuit breaker.
That's what we were calling for.
Rather than the North standing alone.
That's what we were saying. There should be a national circuit break, leaving the north of England under restrictions and the rest of the country not.
Was that the view, without being overly emotive about it, but did you and your fellow Metro mayors feel that the north was standing alone?
Well, the thing was, if you go back to the start of the pandemic, it went up from the south, and it was national lockdown when it was there, and but when we had the high case rate and it was about to come back down the country, it was then regional and tiers, and did we feel like we were standing alone? Definitely, very much so. It just felt that we were treated in a way that other parts of the country wouldn't be treated. There is honestly no way that a borough in Greater London, or I would say in the wider South East, would be treated like Bolton were treated. No way at all.
I'm going to move on to another topic linked to this, which is the debate about Tier 3 restrictions, which occurred in October 2020, shortly after this meeting. And I'm going to summarise your evidence and then ask you a couple of questions, if I may. You described that there was unprecedented engagement between Greater Manchester and the government around this time, around the 7th of October, your wife's anniversary, your anniversary, and over the next few days. And the issue concerned, the sticking point concerned financial support. And you raised the concern that there needed to be sufficient financial support. And to summarise quite a complex issue, the sticking point related to the level of financial support. A national lockdown would have 80% of a person's salary, whereas is it right that what was offered in these discussions was less than that 80%?
So my memory of this meeting is very much that it was dominated by financial support, because this was about the tier system in principle, not what they hadn't told us they were about to do within a day or two. But we were really clear at this stage, you can't do this, you can't do a Bolton to everybody. You know, you've got to put in place proper financial support. And to be fair, I think Matt Hancock understood that, and he said he would take it back to the Treasury. I remember him saying that in that meeting. I said, look, I can't support measures without that support. And I said really clearly at that point, you can't tell people working in pubs, bingo halls, betting shops, that they only get 67% of their wages, because that's what was kind of building around at this time, that there would be a kind of a tier 3 package for people whose workplaces were closed. And
what would the answer be to someone saying, well, 67% of someone's wage is sufficient compared to 80%?
Well, these, by definition, are people on the lowest wages. So when everyone else was sitting in their gardens on 80%, why would they get 67%? What would possibly be the justification for that?
Yes.
Other than that they were in the north of England in low-paid jobs. Oh, well, you know, that's how it felt to us. And that's why this is the issue about the Tier 3 debate. It became a point of principle about this. They tried to portray that we were quibbling about 75 million or 65. It wasn't. We were saying you've got to put enough money in the system to give people on very low wages that at least an 80% furlough scheme.
I'm going to return to that in a moment. But
except we are coming to that in a later module, Mr. Keating.
Yes. Yes.
Have we had enough for this module?
Nearly. We're nearly there, my lady. I'm going to trespass on your patience just for a moment. In relation to this, and this is going to the points to assist my lady, and is in relation to whether a tier system was going to work. And actually, in relation to that, isn't it right that you had a meeting on the 14th of October with Jonathan Van Tam?
Yes.
And a junior Minister for Health. And there was expression, you asked whether the tier system, would it be effective? Would it address rising cases? And what was the response in relation to that?
So we were sceptical about the tier system because we've been under it since July and it hadn't worked. And we knew if they carried on with the 67% furlough that there would be definite damage to people's lives and people's businesses. So in meetings, and particularly with Jonathan Van Tam, myself and the 10 leaders of Greater Manchester said, give us, if we're going to do this, you have to guarantee to us that this is actually going to work and it's going to bring the cases down, the R number down below 1.
And the response?
That he couldn't give us that guarantee. Okay. And I think, if I could, this gets to the heart, really, of my evidence and what I wanted to say today.
I'm going to draw that together and give you that opportunity and draw this topic together. And it's right, you didn't. There wasn't an agreement between you and central government. That's a matter of fact.
We heard the Deputy Chief Medical Officer say the Tier 3 approach wasn't going to necessarily bring our case rate down.
And you're aware that there has been criticism in central government and in wider media of the stance you took, that you were being obstructive and had behaved appallingly. I'm quoting a minute in a meeting. I want to give you the opportunity to be able to respond to that criticism, and then I'm going to move on to another topic.
I've seen that minute, the COVID-0 minute, and frankly, it's nothing short of a disgraceful, the points that were made in that minute. To say, quote back what you just said, the Mayor of Greater Manchester was behaving appallingly. it wasn't me that was behaving appallingly. It was the people in that room that were behaving appallingly, because they were about to impose a policy on Greater Manchester which they knew didn't work. And that's something that I've only now realised looking at other people's statements to this inquiry. And it makes me angry on behalf of the people of Greater Manchester that they sat in that room and they imposed a policy that they had been advised by Sage and others would not work. Indeed, I'm reading Matt Hancock's evidence to this inquiry. I could give you the number if you wish to call it up.
We're going to have the advantage of him giving evidence himself in a few days' time.
So let me just quote from his written evidence. I won't. This is critical for us, because I think the people of Greater Manchester need to hear this and understand this. He says in his evidence about Tier 3, I was in despair that we had announced a policy that we knew would not work.
Did he explain or express that to you around the time of your discussions and negotiations?
No, he didn't.
No.
And I see this conversation in this COVID-O committee where they then starting to talk about a punishment beating for Greater Manchester, that Lancashire should have a lighter set of measures imposed than Greater Manchester since they had shown willingness to cooperate. Tougher measures should be imposed on Greater Manchester that day, because we stood up for people in our city region who would otherwise have really struggled had they gone into that lockdown without the funds to help them. Because we took that stand, they decided to make an example of us. And it's unbelievable for me now to look at evidence saying they knew it didn't work. They knew Tier 3 didn't work. They knew that, but they were still going to impose it on us without enough financial support.
Mr. Burnham, I'm going to invite you to pause there. I wanted to give you that opportunity. I think you've had a reasonable opportunity to deal with that matter, and I'm going to move on and hopefully have your assistance in relation to another topic. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. Communications. And another area I've been invited to explore with you is the wider communications from central government and how they were received on a local level from your perspective, and in relation to certain communities, minority ethnic communities. From your experience, was there issues with the central communication, central government communication, or blanket messaging as you described it?
Yes, I mean, we worked hard to make sure that the core messages from the government were put into languages that could be understood by everybody in Greater Manchester. I think, if I'm being fair, I think there was some collaboration on these matters between public health information experts in Greater Manchester and at the government level, but it was a constant challenge. The absence of British Sign Language interpreter at the daily briefings was unforgivable, to be honest, all the way through.
We've dealt with that in evidence already, but thank you. I'm going to move on really as a final section, and firmly with lessons learned, how to do things better going forward. There may be a couple of topics you might want to raise, but one of them you've touched upon already, and I promised you I would return back to it, would be your view as to the placement of the metro mayors in a civil resilience structure.
Yeah.
I think I said I'd come back to that.
Yes.
That's something you wanted to deal with.
Yes, I just think it's what should be there in a situation like this. Here's my central argument. A more devolved approach to the pandemic would have been a safer approach to the pandemic. The way we run this country is often concentrating power in a very small number of hands in Downing Street and in the middle of Whitehall. It's dysfunctional in normal times. I would say it's dangerous to run things like that in a pandemic. You look at countries like Germany that adopted a much more devolved approach to these things.
Just pausing there, in terms of, you had the Hine Review when you were post the swine flu pandemic. Mm-hmm. Is there any view that you have regarding the principle of subsidiarity in relation to this?
But that was the central call from the Hine Review, which I set up. It said that a future pandemic should be handled in a much more delegated way, devolved way, with much greater subsidiarity. and it would appear that had not been taken on board. And the thing that I kind of will come back to is it just because the absence of those structures just meant that people, whenever I spoke to them in Downing Street or Whitehall, they just didn't seem to know how people were feeling in our part of the world. It had been miserable, really, all through 2020, with almost endless restrictions. But they just didn't seem to know. If I could just inform the committee on the kind of final day when we were about to have Tier 3 imposed on the 20th of October 2020, I had a final call with the then Prime Minister, Mr. Johnson. And he was saying, we just need you to agree to these Tier 3 restrictions and the package of support. And I said, well, we can't, it's not enough. You know, we've been under restrictions for a long time. He said, what do you mean? I said, we've been under restrictions since July. You do know about that, don't you?
And what was the response?
To me, it didn't seem that he did know about that. He wasn't aware that we'd been struggling all of that time. And I think it's the absence of a kind of place every week where people can report in to say, this is how it feels for us at this moment in time. That, I think, led to a situation where there just wasn't an understanding of what some of the things the government was doing, what they were actually, the impact they were having on people's lives. And that's why I hope this inquiry will make some clear recommendations about a more devolved infrastructure that can then both be represented at a national UK level, but then be given more responsibility to deal with the pandemic at a regional and local level.
Mr. Burnham, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Questions. My lady, I think you've granted permission for questions from one of the core participants.
I have, Mr. Weatherby.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Burnham, as I think you know, I represent the COVID bereaved Families for Justice UK group. And you've known of that group since it formed because you were in fact one of the first public figures to support the call for this public inquiry.
Yes.
I've got permission just for two short points picking up on the matters you've just been asked about. I'm just going to ask you about the period in the middle of September and then briefly the middle of October. On the 16th of September, you wrote a letter to Mr. Hancock, which I'll put up just to remind you of it. It's 165174. Now, I'm not going to read through that, but it's a letter from you to Mr. Hancock, Secretary of State for Health, setting out a whole raft of proposals for escalation measures to be implemented, quite sophisticated measures to be implemented in Greater Manchester in response to the rising cases across the 10 council areas, including support for self-isolation, local food support, services for vulnerable groups, vulnerable people, a call for some changes to local enforcement powers to target enforcement better, and localised enhancement of test, trace and isolate that you've already mentioned. Is that right?
Yes.
And then if we can just flick onto the next page.
I think this is what I was saying a moment ago. This is what a more devolved approach to the pandemic, in our view, would have looked like.
The reason I wanted it to put up is so that we can all see, the inquiry can see, the level of sophistication and thought that Greater Manchester have put into this. But the second series of bullet points on the second page is then refer to the other side of the coin, which is what you needed from government. And that included additional funding to help the self-isolation proposals. You needed some legislative changes to support targeted approach to enforcement and realistic levels of funding to enable local and time-limited interventions, as you've said. So again, sophisticated set of proposals from your side, and then a list of asks, and of course the perennial need for resources to support that. Is that right?
Yes.
So we can take that down, please, and just briefly put up 165173. So the next day, Mr. Hancock responds in a series of WhatsApp messages with you. And I think this rather evidences what you said earlier about him having a cordial, helpful engagement with you on this level. Is that right?
Yes.
And he's checking with you things which are essentially just needed to be checked over with the letter. And you're making clear at the bottom is that you'd be prepared to do localised curfews. You're concerned about the confusing patchwork of restrictions across the 10 council areas, and a clear sense that they're of limited and diminishing effectiveness. And so you're explaining to Mr. Hancock the purpose of your letter and what you need, and that seems to be going all fine in terms of your communication in detail and his orientation to you. Now, in terms of the financial support, am I right that this was particularly related to low-paid and vulnerable groups? Because without financial support, then there was no way of ensuring the effectiveness of these measures to reduce the high case level.
Yes, this was a theme that I said before we'd raised all the way through. Greater Manchester has a higher number of people who can't access sick pay, or who don't get paid if they're not
so people on 0 hours, people in the gig economy. You mentioned some self-employed people.
There was a survey by Unison Northwest early in the pandemic that found that 80% of domiciliary care workers in the Northwest said they wouldn't be able to self-isolate if they were asked to do so because they wouldn't be paid. That really brings home, if you can't fix that issue, you can't fix the pandemic.
And you're acutely aware of that as the mayor for the area.
Yeah.
Now, we've looked at the immediate response from Mr. Hancock by the WhatsApps, but did this letter of the 16th of September, did this actually lead to any greater financial resources being provided?
I think there were some modest moves later in 2020, but they were never, there was a scheme to be administered by local authorities, but it never got close to the simplicity of the scheme that myself and the mayor of the Liverpool City region were calling.
So these extra resources, to a large extent, you were not able to implement them because of the lack of resourcing.
They never were, we never.
Okay, second point, and briefly, fast forward a month, but same theme, 19th of October, I just want to put up a note prepared by the Cabinet Office, 104731. And again, I'm not going to go through it, but I just wanted to prompt your memory. So this is a note of a meeting with your council leaders and Mr. Jenrick, Minister of State. And this, I think, was aimed at reaching agreement on Tier 3 and from your side, certainly, a financial support package for Greater Manchester. I just want to look at the headline section that's been highlighted there. The summary, and that's Robert Jenrick himself, he summed up by stating that there seems to be a lot of common ground, though not on financial support measures. And then in the second bullet point, he reaffirmed that a hardship fund was not an option tabled by Her Majesty's government. Later, we don't need to go to it, but later in the document, Ed Lister raised, and it was agreed that time wasn't on anybody's side, given rapidly increasing infection rates. The reference to your request for a hardship fund was, again, going back to the things we've just discussed, assistance for the self-employed and those who simply couldn't afford to stay off work. So it obviously hadn't been resourced up to that point. Was there any further financial resourcing for these measures from there, or did the government stick to its guns in terms of saying, well, we like your ideas, but we're just not going to pay for it?
No, it stuck to its guns. I mean, what we were calling for was money to top up that 67% furlough, that top-up wages point. That's what that refers to. And the government at that point were saying, no, you can have 65 million, which was the core kind of funding that everyone had been offered. And in fact, although they claimed that they were negotiating with us, that was a formula actually that they were applying to everybody in tier 3. So the next day, we go into the final because this was the 19th of October, the next day, the 20th. The final conversation I had with Robert Jenrick, that was the last person I spoke to before they said we're imposing. Well, he told me that, he said, you've been through the whole thing now, we're going to impose. And I said, well, we've tried to work with you. We don't think what we're saying is unreasonable. So I take it with you imposing, you're imposing what you put on the table, the 65 million. Oh no, there's no guarantee of that.
Yes.
And what happened was there was then I went outside to tell the world that we were having this imposed on us, and we tried to avoid it, and we tried to get the best that we could, and we didn't agree with it. And it was in the middle of that when a Greater Manchester MP, Lucy Powell, sent a text to my political director saying, I'm in a meeting with Hancock. He's telling us about the details of the imposition, and he said that we are going to get 25 million. So not only did they not guarantee that, they tried to then initially say they were going to punish us with this.
Less money.
Yeah, and this is how this whole, at this stage, how this whole thing was handled. It was like classic divide and rule.
Yeah.
And should ministers be doing that in the middle of a national emergency? No, they should not.
I had a third point, but you've already answered it. So thank you, Mr. Burnham.
Thank you.
Mr. Weatherby. Mr. Keating, that completes the question.
It is.
Mr. Burnham.
It does, my lady. Thank
Mr.
you.
Burnham, thank you very much indeed for your help.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Right, I think I'm being encouraged to take a break now. I shall return at 25 past.
Thank you, my lady.